Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak on the Westpac New Zealand Bill, a private bill promoted by the Honourable Craig Foss. Mr Speaker, the Green Party will be supporting this bill. This bill is the final instalment of the process of forcing the Australian-owned banks to be locally incorporated. Getting Westpac to move its back office to New Zealand has been a protracted process, which has involved a lot of kicking and screaming. But finally, it seems that we have managed to get Westpac to incorporate in New Zealand and actually go through the necessary hoops so that we can have one of our major banks incorporated in New Zealand and able to be controlled to some degree by the Reserve Bank, our regulator. This bill has a number of ironies around it. For example, one of the ironies is that the bill is structured in such a way as to be tax neutral for Westpac. The irony of this, of course, is that Westpac itself is a massive tax avoider and was convicted of tax avoidance in the High Court. Westpac was found to have avoided illegally $586 million of tax by Justice Harrison in a case that was settled a year or so ago. That was finally settled in an out-of-court settlement that was released on December 23rd, 2009. So many of the listeners to this debate may have not noticed or heard about this particular massive tax avoidance case that Westpac was involved in because, of course, it was settled just before Christmas and announced at that time. So this bill has special provisions in order to ensure tax neutrality in it. The thing about Westpac and the other Australian-owned banks is that they operate in their own interests, which is perfectly understandable, and we should expect nothing else. So, for example, during that period, in the judgment about the activities of Westpac in that tax avoidance case, Westpac had invested about $4.3 billion in the tax avoidance transactions by August 2002, which at the time was 18% of their total assets, which I think is a very interesting insight into Westpac's approach to the New Zealand economy. They had 18% of their total assets invested in tax avoidance activities. So when you think this is an economy which is desperately short of capital, and has been for many years, capital invested into the productive sector, we have one of our major banks who had invested nearly $1 in $5 in their tax avoidance transactions, rather than investing them in the productive economy of New Zealand. So here we are in this Parliament today passing a law that ensures that in the process of transferring these assets there is tax neutrality for Westpac, so they don't actually get more tax liabilities, which is perfectly fine in the process of incorporation in New Zealand. But Westpac itself has a long history of of illegal tax avoidance and was caught out doing so. The way that this works is, I think, an interesting insight into the way Westpac approaches New Zealand and why we need to be pretty cynical about the big banks in order that we regulate them very closely to make sure they work in New Zealand's best interests. The way this particular tax avoidance scheme worked was that the cost of loans were claimed as a tax deduction. So Westpac made these loans to these overseas company effectively, and then the cost of those loans was a tax deduction against the New Zealand tax system, but the interest received on those loans was not taxable. So it was a fantastic arrangement for Westpac. It's how they made a huge amount of money and avoided $500 million worth of tax at the time, because they said that the cost of making these loans was a business cost, so it was so they claimed it was a tax deduction. And then they said, but the interest we've received on these loans is not taxable. And they did that by actually getting the interest in an overseas entity and then transferring it back. So on the one hand, in this bill, we are quite reasonably ensuring that this bill is tax neutral for these certain vesting operations that we're supporting through this bill. But on the other hand, Westpac itself has a long history of snubbing its nose at the New Zealand taxpayer, and in particular in this transaction where they and the other Australian-owned banks were caught unlawfully and illegally avoiding, they were owed $2.5 billion worth of back taxes, including interest payments. In the end, even though Westpac owed $961 million all up, they ended up getting a cut price deal and only paying $760 million to the taxpayer of New Zealand, even though with interest payments, they owed us $960 million. As the judge said at the time, these transactions made no commercial sense. They were purely transactions to unlawfully avoid tax. Now that tells us something about the way that Westpac views New Zealand. It tells us something about the way that the big Australian banks view New Zealand. They don't see us as a base which they want to invest in and support. They see us as a profit centre to send money back to the Australian owners. And that doesn't surprise me, and it shouldn't surprise anyone in our attitude towards the banks that they would behave in us, the big Australian banks, in this particular way. There are a number of other aspects of the operation of Westpac that have been a cause for concern. We've heard about some of the issues around the asset bubbles that have occurred in New Zealand over the last decade. These have primarily been in the housing sector and also in rural land. There have been asset bubbles in both of those sectors. And it has been the big Australian banks that have been promoting and inflating these asset bubbles in an incredibly irresponsible way. For example, frontline staff were encouraged to push loans onto people that could not afford them because Westpac and other banks wanted to increase their loan book, to increase their profits. And so we got this huge bubble in the housing market and elsewhere, which we're still trying to get ourselves out of. And so in that respect, Westpac was not acting in our national interests. Of course, the issue of the pay packet for the CEO of Westpac has become an issue as well. $5 million, the most incredible and ridiculous pay that all Westpac customers end up paying for. And then there's the issue of the tender for the master banking contract. Westpac is the government banker. The master banking contract hasn't been tendered since David Lange was a Prime Minister. And thanks to pressure from the Green Party, it appears that finally it looks like we are going to a tender process for the government's banking contract, and I congratulate the government for seeing the light in that respect. Mr. Speaker, we need a strategy in New Zealand both to increase savings, and the banks obviously will be part of that, but we need to find a way to actually move capital into the productive sectors of the economy. The banking system, in particular the big Australian banks like Westpac, have been a profound failure in the moving capital into the useful part of the economy. Instead, what they've done is pushed it into the not useful part of the economy, which has been the housing asset bubble. As Mr. English says many times, it was a debt-fuelled asset bubble. And Mr. English is absolutely right to call it a debt-fuelled asset bubble. I see Mr. Bennett over there shaking his head. He doesn't agree with Mr. English. Well, I agree with Mr. English. He's right. It was a debt-fuelled asset bubble in which the banks were shoving the capital into the non-productive sectors of the New Zealand economy. We need an alternative strategy, in fact. And one of the strategies that is on the table is to actually invest in the existing clean technology sector in New Zealand. We have a number of clean technology energy companies in New Zealand that are very successful, have already started exporting. They could be the core and foundation of a clean technology exporting sector to the world. These are, of course, the state-owned energy companies that the government proposes to privatise. These state-owned energy companies already have a lot of expertise and experience in clean technology and could provide the foundation for a clean technology export sector to the world. The great thing about those companies is that they're not going to fall into overseas ownership and move overseas. They also have access to a lot of capital, and they can do that through their own resources or by issuing green energy bonds. So instead of using the banks like Westpac as a way to very ineffectively mobilise capital, because the banks tend to put it into the wrong sectors, we can actually mobilise capital directly by getting the energy companies to issue green energy bonds, the capital of which then is directed into the clean technology sector, which then is a platform to export to the rest of the world, and also to partner with the private sector. Now, the Green Party supports keeping their companies in public ownership, but they should partner with green energy entrepreneurs so that they can actually export to the rest of the world. And they can mobilise capital using green energy bonds to achieve that, rather than having to rely on the banks, who have a very conservative strategy, which is to simply invest in what they think are safe returns, which is primarily land, particularly the housing market, but the rural land market. Those markets, and making bubbles in those markets, is fine for the banks, or at least in the short term. However, it's not in the national interest of New Zealand, where we want to promote capital being moved into the productive sector. Mr. Speaker, we will be supporting this bill. We think it's important that Westpac and the other banks are incorporated in New Zealand and are under the regulatory control of the Reserve Bank. This is part of that step, but this is far from the solution to the challenge that we have in our capital markets in New Zealand. And while it is an important step, actually it is just the beginning of the reforms we need to make.
Rahui Katini.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.